Trust is a structure that rarely breaks all at once. Let me ask you something. Have you ever spent 40 years repairing what was broken, only to realize you were the one being dismantled? I am Frank Henderson. I walked out of a recovery center into the Chesapeake winter with a manila envelope, $107 in singles, and a phone that had been dead for weeks. My daughter, Madison, promised to be there at 11 o'clock in the morning. She wasn't. Looking at that empty grey horizon, I knew a silent betrayal had already taken root in the fog. If you found yourself standing on that hollow pier, would you have called to demand an explanation? Or would you have walked away to find the truth for yourself? I walked until the scent of cedar vanished. The 4-mile trek from the bus stop to my shipyard in the Chesapeake was a slow exercise in bracing for impact. When I finally reached the gate, I didn't see my name anymore. The weathered sign that had read Henderson and Daughter for a generation was gone, replaced by a cold, backlit logo for a conglomerate called Ecotech. Looking back now, I realized that some structures don't collapse in a single storm. They rot quietly from the inside, until even a light breeze is enough to bring the whole legacy down. Tanner was waiting for me by the main hangar. He looked less like a boat builder and more like a spreadsheet in a $3,000 jacket. He offered me a smile that was strictly transactional, a hollow greeting designed to manage a liability. He spoke about restructuring and liquidity pivots while I stood there in my old wool coat. He informed me that my $105,000 retirement fund had been absorbed to cover the shipyard's debts he had quietly engineered during my 6 weeks of silence. He had been laying the groundwork for months, filing clandestine paperwork and commissioning the new designs long before I ever stepped foot in recovery. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, and it appeared my equity had been wiped out. If I'm being honest, I understood in that moment the shadow of dependency I had allowed to grow. In the fog of losing June, I had signed a power of attorney, handing Tanner the keys to my world because the weight of holding them felt unbearable. Grief is a professional manipulator. It makes you look for a pilot when you should be standing at the rudder. Tanner hadn't saved the shipyard. He had harvested it. He assumed that a 62-year-old man with $107 and a dead phone was a ghost that had already finished haunting him. Madison was standing in the shadow of the hangar. She wouldn't look at me. I didn't shout. I simply walked into the back office and retrieved my mahogany toolbox. It was the only asset in that entire 3-acre lot that he couldn't legally leverage. Gavin's living room smelled like aged wood and quiet intent. He was the return on an investment I'd made 27 years ago when the rest of the world saw him as driftwood. Back then, Gavin was a 16-year-old runaway. I had taught him that you don't force the wood to bend. You understand its nature until it moves with you. Now, with a law degree and a decade of experience in corporate litigation, he was the one teaching me. Tanner has been efficient, Frank, but he's been arrogant, Gavin said. He's been treating your silence as a vacancy, not a strategy. I took a sip of black coffee and felt the heat ground me. For 3 years, I had used isolation as a shroud to smudge out the edges of my grief. But 42 days of facing my own history had taught me that you can't restore a ship while you're drowning in the bilge. I didn't need the shadows to numb the pain anymore. I needed the clarity to see where Tanner had left his fingerprints. Gavin had been tracking Ecotech for months. Tanner had promised them a clean sweep, positioning me as a broken man who was mentally unfit to hold the deed. He was selling my reputation along with the land. But Tanner thought he was dealing with a victim. He didn't realize he was dealing with someone who had finally stopped fighting the tide and started calculating its force. Tanner threw a party on my father's dock. He called it a future connection gala. While I sat in a rented room, my son-in-law was serving champagne on the same planks of wood where I had taught my daughter how to tie a bowline knot. He was dangling a $2,400,000 franchising agreement like a trophy, presenting himself as the visionary who had salvaged a business from the hands of a grieving, unstable old man. He had spent the last 6 weeks refining the story of my collapse, feeding it to Madison. He told her I was drifting through shadows, spending the last of my pride in despair. He had spent years gaslighting her, weaponizing our shared grief for June to make her doubt her own judgment and rely solely on his. I realized then that a subscription to someone else's lies is a bill you eventually pay in full. Tanner needed the intellectual property rights to my proprietary anti-corrosion technique, a patent I had carefully kept in my personal name, never assigning it to the Shipyard's corporate entity. To the investors, that formula was the real asset. He was using my grief as a professional lever. But narcissists like Tanner always self-destruct by assuming they are the only ones capable of calculation. While Tanner practiced his victory speech on the podium, we were looking at the records of a shell company he had set up 8 months before June even got sick. He was building an empire on a foundation of rot. Pier 4 was a ghost Tanner never saw coming. It was parcel 4471B, a stretch at the corner of Maple and Bayview Drive that my father-in-law had left to me personally. Tanner's lawyers thought the shipyard was one contiguous block. Tanner had provided them with a doctored survey map, banking on the fact that corporate giants rarely double-check the historical fine print of a family-owned plot until the ink is dry. But the actual deep water access point belonged to me. Gavin had also found Donna Briggs from Salisbury by digging through a trail of dismissed civil complaints from years ago cases where Tanner had successfully bullied his victims into silence. She was the daughter of a man Tanner had dismantled years ago. Tanner had used the same patterns, gaining power of attorney and draining accounts. Looking back, I see that when you try to erase a man's history, you almost always forget the evidence that history leaves behind. I sat in Gavin's office, staring at the documents proving Tanner had moved my $105,000 into a private account. I had $107 in my pocket and 6 weeks of mental clarity in my blood. For the first time in years, the water. 11 days before the city council meeting, Gavin filed the title objection. A title objection doesn't scream, it just stops everything in its tracks. Without my participation in Tanner's narrative of a broken father, he was just a man holding a pile of useless contracts. I visited Madison's apartment. I didn't call ahead. I handed her the folder Gavin had prepared. It contained the sworn statement of Donna Briggs and the court transcripts from Tanner's past. It was a map of his history. "I'm not here to argue with you, Madison," I said quietly. "I'm here to give you the information you deserve." I didn't wait for her to open it. I walked away, leaving the silence to do the rest of the work. The Riverside Community Centre was lit with cold, clinical light. Tanner sat in the front row, radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already inherited the world. I found a seat in the back corner. When Tanner finally saw me, the colour of his face changed to the shade of a winter sky. The development permit was called at 7:41 p.m. Gavin stood up and presented the title objection for parcel 4471B at Bayview Drive. He proved the property was in my personal name. The shift in the room was physical. Tanner's mask shattered. He lost control, shouting about obsolete methods and senile obstructions, exposing his narcissistic rage. Patricia Owens, the council chair, tabled the item a death sentence for the project. Tanner had spent millions trying to erase my name, but he had forgotten that you can't build a future on land that doesn't belong to you. 3 weeks later, Tanner was stripped of his authority. The district attorney's office, moved by Gavin's evidence of felony elder financial abuse, issued a warrant for Tanner's arrest before the week was out. He is currently navigating a series of civil suits for fraud. I recovered the shipyard, and while the cash he drained is tied up in bankruptcy court, the judge has already ordered a lifetime of restitution payments. But the money was a small price to pay for the return of my own name. I cleared out the industrial paint Tanner had used and let the cedar breathe again. Madison came to the pier on a Tuesday morning. We sat on the edge of the dock, watching the tide go out. I told her that some ships are meant to be repaired, not scrapped. I needed her to see that the man who raised her was finally back at the rudder. The recovered assets went into founding the June Henderson Center. It is a workshop where people coming out of the same fog I inhabited can find a purpose. We teach them how to restore these vintage vessels. Gavin sits on the board, ensuring the legal foundation is as solid as the ships we build. To those of you listening, the people who betray you are counting on you to stay broken. Do not give them that satisfaction. I spent 40 years as a contractor, but my greatest project was the 42 days I spent learning that I was enough without the shadows of the past. Sobriety of mind left me standing when the storm finally arrived. And that, more than any bank balance, is the true legacy of the tide. Have you ever experienced a moment where you realized your kindness was actually an investment in your own future? I would like to hear your perspective on how you found the strength to rebuild when the foundation has been taken away from you.